book, The Theory of Applicative Justice, an empirical pragmatic approach to correcting racial injustice, contributes to a large body of work that also includes titles like White Privilege and Black Rights, The Injustice of U.S. Police Racial Profiling and Homicide, The Ethics and Mores of Race, Equality After the History of Philosophy. Her scholarship spans various subjects from ethics and disasters and inclusive feminism to the philosophy of science, race, and mixed race identities. Today, we'll be talking about affirmative action. I'm really excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Let me just add, there are two recent books that came out in the past 6 months. One is Democracy, a very short introduction from the Oxford Very Short Introduction series. And the other, which is just out this month, is Intersectionality, a philosophical framework.
Very cool. I've
Yeah.
recently been trying to write a little bit more. You've written a lot. Do you enjoy the process of writing? How has that been for you?
People say, oh, you must love it. You write so much. Not really. It's just what I do.
It's
It's
more
just,
of a profession.
well, it's just more of it's just more of a kind of normal, it's become a normal activity for me.
Yeah. You do you
I
try to
get
write
anxious
on a daily
if I don't
basis?
do it. Do I try? Well, it's not trying to write on a daily basis. It's that if I'm working on a project and I don't have other things that I have to do, then the default mode is to write.
Mm,
But I also teach, and I do things like our conversation and various other academic obligations. So I can't. I don't always have the time to write on a daily basis, but I do write whenever the pressing obligations open up.
yeah. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. The previous few episodes, we've gone deep into, the philosophy of race, the history of race, and understanding how racism impacts people's experiences on a day-to-day basis. And as we move forward, I'm really interested to now get into how some of these things have been embedded into institutions. And so today we're going to be talking about higher education and affirmative action. So perhaps we can start with the word affirmative action and maybe first get a brief into what that is. What is affirmative action?
Okay, so affirmative action was a policy, and I say was, it's in the rearview mirror now, um, that allowed for taking positive action to include people who had previously been excluded from certain desirable situations, such as employment or admission to college. And there were a couple of directives to take affirmative action that went out to government contractors. The first was from President Kennedy in 1961. The second was from President Johnson. And it's really important to note that from the very beginning, affirmative action did not mean affirming the people who would newly be hired or admitted. It meant taking positive action. And the reason positive action was necessary is that there were laws against racial discrimination, but discrimination could still occur, and it could be buried in arguments about qualifications or institutional fit or a number of other things, so that you didn't have the element of active discrimination. And these cases took years to go through the courts. So in order to somehow do an end run around them, policies of affirmative action were developed. And from the very beginning, the policies of affirmative action received a very negative public response. So the first form of affirmative action were quotas, and quotas would specify a certain number of minorities who had to be hired or admitted. And in terms of higher education, I'm going to talk about the history of Supreme Court rulings pertaining to higher education in a minute. But quotas were very quickly struck down. Quotas were very unpopular, in addition to the perception that quotas were unfair because if so many non-whites were admitted or hired, that means whites would not have those positions. There was a broad assumption that the people who benefited from affirmative action were not as qualified, that they were merely being admitted on the basis of race or gender. And affirmative action probably did the greatest, produced the greatest benefit for women. So gender was part of affirmative action policies.
Hmm.
So, in terms of higher education, just quickly, let me go through the history, um, that brings us to the present point. There was a case known as Bakke versus the state of California, and in that case, the Supreme Court um, very clearly struck down anything that would look like quotas. So
Hmm.
you could not specifically set aside a certain number of places for minorities. But at this point, the court introduced the notion of diversity. So diversity is a result of affirmative action where you have an integrated student body or an integrated workforce. But diversity could only be, and they recognize the value of diversity. But in a number of other cases, they made it very clear that affirmative action policies could not be used to further social justice in society or to correct past ills. So there's just this very narrow tailoring of policies that would further diversity, and they had to pass standards of strict scrutiny, which meant they couldn't go. Strict scrutiny and narrow tailoring together meant that you could admit people. Now we're talking about higher education to further diversity, but you couldn't. You had to do it with minimal harm to non-minorities. And there were a number of other cases in which the court upheld this goal of diversity. Probably the most famous one involved the University of Michigan Law School, and Sandra Day O'Connor wrote uh, the opinion in this case and said that the institution and in a sense society had an investment in a diverse body of law students, and race could be considered but only holistically, and that meant that each candidate had to be looked at in total in terms of their qualifications compared with those of other candidates, and minority racial identity could be added as a plus, but it couldn't
Hmm.
be added automatically. There was another Michigan case where for undergraduate admissions, race was automatically given extra points, and that was knocked down as unconstitutional. So so there was a period of waiting. There were a couple of Texas cases in which it was actually the same case that came twice before the court, where the court upheld the notion of holistic considerations of candidates, not a quota system, not points for race. And then we came to the most recent case in 2023, Harvard College and University of North Carolina. And this is the most uh, definitive case and the final blow to affirmative action, in which was said that affirmative action, the argument was affirmative action violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution because it used race, which is a very invidious uh, 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 concept and characteristic, as a factor for admission. And the way that the court interpreted the use of race as invidious went against the traditional applications of the 14th Amendment, which were against discrimination against minorities, and it interpreted the use of race as discriminatory against whites who were also applying. So that's how affirmative action was struck down. Now, why is it important? First of all, affirmative action has been the main tool for integration in elite schools, was the main tool. But elite schools that have predominantly white and wealthy and well-prepared students only comprise 0.8%, less than 1% of the college population. So it doesn't pertain to historically Black colleges and universities, doesn't pertain to Hispanic serving, Native American serving. It certainly doesn't pertain to community colleges who basically have open enrollment, and doesn't pertain to a vast number of state and public schools that have already have large enough applicant pools of competitive candidates of color. But the spirit of affirmative action, even though the practice of affirmative action was only really necessary for elite colleges and universities, the spirit of affirmative action permeated higher education. And along with the takedown of affirmative action, various states have moved against offices and programs on campus known as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a situation that I think calls for a reconceptualization. And concepts are very important because they ultimately lead to labels and slogans that people can latch on to. So it's not just a semantic issue. It's a question of redoing how you think about the whole thing. Now, in the Roberts Court, which took down affirmative action, the Chief Justice John Roberts allowed. He said, well, military schools could still practice it, and the military academies were even more selective than the elite schools. And he also said that that issues of race could be addressed in the application essay, in which students, it was all right if students could talk about how they had been courageous or how they had overcome barriers due to racism, but they couldn't rest on their identities. This is sort of problematic because racial identities bring with them those kinds of experiences. Very hard for people to talk about experiences of racism without in some way bringing their own identities into it. But there's a whole new industry that's cropped up, tutoring students on how to do that. What's of particular interest is that the court has a very thin view of race. So the first signal of that is race is believed to be a characteristic that a person shares with all members of a group. In other words, there's no individuality concerning race. It's just a group label. That's how the Roberts Court saw it. And then later on, there's a very interesting quotation where John Roberts says that for too long, people in higher education have used the skin color as a test for whether or not to admit somebody, and there has to be something that counts for more than skin color. So this thin view of race, that it's only related to group labels or skin color, is actually a false use of race. And if you like, I can go on and say how the reality of race can allow for reconceptualization after the takedown of affirmative action and DEI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to get into that. I had a few questions as you were talking, and so the first one is, you had talked about how there was a case much earlier that had struck down affirmative action in California, correct?
Right.
So my
Bucky.
question, my
Yeah.
question is, what were some of the practices that Stanford, for example, or Berkeley would have used that without affirmative action still aimed for a diverse student body?
Well, the truth of the matter is that California was one of 13 states that, on a state level, no longer allowed for affirmative action policies. So some of the things they used were social class, difficult experiences. But what happened in the University of California Medical School at Davis is that minority enrollment dropped about 20 percentage points from 14% of likely high school graduates who were not admitted to 34% who were not admitted. In other words, the enrollment in the law schools and medical schools in California that had been boosted by affirmative action plummeted.
So it did have impacts. But was that like widespread, or was it just in a few specific? Like, why was it there as opposed to the undergraduate student body?
Well, because there was still, because first of all, these cases tend to be geared towards very specific institutions. And I don't know the figures for the drop in the undergraduate student body, but the general um, perception is that as affirmative action has been eroded and people have been looking for other ways of sort of getting around an explicit counting of race, the result of that has been a drop in minority enrollment before this final case.
Hmm. So, something that fascinates me about affirmative action and these kind of policies is they're implemented all over the world. And it's often done to try to boost up people, as you said earlier, who are often left out politically or left out of opportunities in the past.
Right.
What are some of the approaches that you have seen different places take outside of the quota system? So are there other approaches to affirmative action that aren't the quota system?
Well, yeah, the holistic approach that the Supreme Court allowed until 2023.
But that one
In
seems
other words,
more, yeah, no,
yeah,
sorry. I was just going to say the
sorry,
quota system seems to enforce a certain level of accountability where it's like, okay, if we're budgeting, 10% of our seats to people from
right,
marginalized communities, then
right,
there's a sense of accountability.
right.
With the holistic approach, it feels like even though there was, I went to Georgetown, for example. I mean, the black student rate is still lower than 5%. And so it's like
Right.
when you take the kind of holistic affirmative action approach, it's also doesn't really seem to work.
Yeah, the other aspect to the holistic approach, which many schools did have to take, not just the elite schools, is that it's a shift in focus from the subjects of affirmative action, which would be students of color or women, to the resulting body being diversified. And that body can very well remain predominantly white. Now, when Sandra Day O'Connor wrote her opinion um, in Grutter, which was the Michigan Law School case, she said that in 25 years, this is in 2003, in 25 years, there'll be enough of a change in generation, given this holistic approach, that we'll no longer need any form of affirmative action. Well, the court didn't wait until
Hmm.
2028. They actually made their decision in 2023. But let me say, look, affirmative action, holistically considered, is dead. It's as dead as quota systems. It cannot be implemented. It's against the law, and many schools depend on federal funding in some way. They depend on state funding, and they cannot afford to go afoul of these laws. Otherwise, they'd constantly be involved in lawsuits and settlements. However, here's what I think. The understanding of what race is that the Supreme Court was working with is the same as the understanding of race that you have in the census, in the U.S. Census. There's a set, even after they've now changed they're going to change the census. It's the same thing. There's a set number of single-digit categories, and everybody fits into those categories. And the assumption is that there is some reality underlying those divisions among human beings. But what has happened since the late 20th century is what was previously believed to be a biological foundation for racial identities
Hmm.
is no longer of any use in the sciences. So you do not have a metaphysical or a scientific foundation for racial differences in the way that people, including Roberts, are still assuming exists. So, Roberts says, for instance, that he charges people in higher education with relying on skin color as a standard for admission. He does against minorities, and a standard for admission for minorities. I mean, Roberts is against using skin color for minorities, the way to admit them. But the truth of the matter is, there's more variation in skin color within any one of the main racial groups than between any two of them or among them. So there's
Mm,
greater variation in so-called racial traits within racial groups than between racial groups. The reality of human existence is you do not have people neatly divided into 5 or 6 different races. You have a
yeah.
multiplicity, probably hundreds of categories that you cannot even define. Some of them are ethnicities, but even ethnicities don't have a coherent definition. Some ethnic groups are distinguished by skin color, others by tradition, others by religion, by language, by national origin, by some combination of those things. So what I think is colleges need to think more realistically based on the research that has been conducted within their own walls in recent decades. And instead of thinking of races, start thinking of multiplicities.
Hmm.
Start thinking of multiplicities, and instead of thinking of inclusion, because the very idea of inclusion is, well, you already have a group um, that's thriving and it has certain benefits, and now you want to include more people into that group. That's really the model of diversity. And what I'm suggesting is, instead of inclusion, we should do some real affirmation, not affirmative action as a policy, but real affirmation, and emphasize belonging. So make sure that the members of these multiplicities have experiences in college that support their sense of belonging. So what you want is a different model. Instead of affirmation, which never was affirmation of the people who were the subjects of affirmative action. Instead of affirmation, you want belonging. You want to make sure that members of these different multiplicities have a sense and an experience of belonging.
So,
And
so
and
how
I
what would
think,
you do differently?
well, I would, instead of listing races, instead of working the list of race, I think colleges need to do some demographic research on what are the different underserved groups whose admission they want to boost. And this part has to be inclusive. Some of them might be poor white people, but you're also going to have groups that don't easily fit in to the 5 or 6 categories of race. You're going to have a lot of people who are mixed. You're going to have a lot of people who identify based on their religion. You're going to have people who identify based
Hmm.
on the languages that are spoken at home. In other words, colleges need to have a more open demographic perspective than just looking at white dominance versus minorities
So,
as defined, minorities as defined by the census.
so a question I have for you is, and this is a point that gets brought up a lot, but when we think about state schools and we think about public schools, it can be argued that because they are funded primarily by tax dollars, they have a responsibility also to the communities that they're serving. But oftentimes it feels like these private universities, especially when they're run more as a business, I think it's an important question to ask, is it their responsibility to handle some of these larger social issues? Or is that something that should be tasked on state and public schools?
Okay, the history has been so far that these private schools see themselves as obligated to handle the larger social issues. They may not do it in a way that's been effective, but they see that as part of their mission. That's why the elite schools used affirmative action the way that they did. Now, as most funding for public schools does not explicitly come from state and federal funding. They can't survive without it. But the combination of state and federal funding, I think, is about a third of their funding. The rest of the money comes from tuition, and some of the tuition is funded through Pell grants. But now, as far as the business, all schools are businesses. I mean, I teach in a college, Lehman College, that is part of the CUNY university system, City University of New York, and the whole system and the individual colleges within the system have to balance their budgets by state law. In other words, they can't, if they spend more than they take in, they have to fix that. They may have a slight extension in time to fix it, but they have to fix it. So colleges, although colleges and universities shy away from saying this in their mission statements, that each and every one is business.
Hmm. So what you're saying, I'm trying to understand, is that the task of, because it is true that private schools, I mean, there's obviously a benefit in promoting to everybody around there that, hey, like,
But
we are interested in these larger social issues,
that's right.
but are the responsibilities the same? I guess was my original question. Like, is the responsibility on a state and public school
Well, let me
different?
ask you a question. What do you mean by responsibility? Do you mean if they don't do the mission, will they be closed down by the state, or what does a responsibility here amount to? Is it
Yeah.
a moral
Yes.
responsibility? Is
I
it
guess I was talking
legal?
about more about a moral responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think the moral responsibility of having internal diversity and helping people advance in life is pretty widely and vaguely, emphasized, vaguely endorsed by every institution of higher education, except maybe for some extremely conservative religious institutions.
Hmm.
So no one. So I think. So the question is not responsibility in a sort of general but vague sense. The question is, what kinds of programs can individual institutions do? Because you really have two things going on here. You have higher education, which is an imaginary. We all have this notion of higher education that we can share, but it doesn't really refer to anything, because what exists in reality are specific institutions and different types of institutions. So
Hmm.
different types of institutions have different types of responsibilities. For example, most community colleges have open enrollment. Anybody can go if they have a high school diploma or a GED. So you might say community colleges are fulfilling their responsibility for higher education to members of their community, who either don't have strong academic records or don't want to spend more money on 4-year schools.
Hmm.
Um, the responsibility, there are stated responsibilities. I mean, if you look at the mission statements across U.S. higher education, they're very vague. They're very elevated. It's to the good of everybody. It's not sure who's supposed to deliver this good. It's things like being, not seeming. The word light is light is used a lot. All of these schools have very lofty ideals,
Yeah.
but their responsibilities are their moral responsibilities are vague. And what it really is going to come down to, given the current crunch in higher education, is we kind of have to trust that they're going to have decent missions and decent responsibilities. But the question is, how are they going to stay in business? How are they
Hmm.
going to stay afloat? Especially there's been a tremendous shift from majors in humanities and minors in humanities to STEM fields, so-called, practical money-earning fields. So something like the humanities, which you can see the value of if you've been exposed to them, but if you're in college just to make more money, somebody's going to have to demonstrate why the experience of taking courses in humanities or majoring in the humanities is worth your time.
Mm,
So the humanities now have a responsibility, I believe, to reinvent themselves in a way that makes them relevant, um,
mm,
in what they have to offer, as opposed to these more practically oriented science and practical science fields.
yeah.
So, in other words, responsibility, sure, but how is it? How does it specifically translate in different institutions?
Mm. So, one thing I always enjoy asking is if we were to envision the ideal higher education system, let's say it was built, how do you envision the distribution of the student body and even larger than that, the workforce? What does that look like?
Okay, so you're going to have some intersection between merit and identity, right? And what you want is so you have to have higher education has to have standards in order for people to move through it. It's just like K through 12 has, you've got to complete grade 3 before you go on to grade 4, that kind of thing. It's not quite in terms of grades, it's more in the collection of credits. Well, what I imagine, if you're talking demographically, is that all of the groups that are identifiable in the population have some proportional presence in higher education. If you are talking in terms of um, uh, social justice, right? In terms of social justice, you want to mirror the proportion of the population in enrollment, and not only enrollment in higher education, but also employment in higher education.
Yeah. I think the place where it's difficult, and I'm curious to know what you think, is I grew up as a child of immigrants, and I grew up around a lot of other immigrants, and understanding the backgrounds that, for example, my parents came from, and the importance that they placed on education, and the kind of the way that I was brought up and a lot of other people is fundamentally different than the typical American ethos and how people are brought up here. And you can notice a
Right,
very clear difference. And because of that, there will also be differences in outcome purely because of the cultural differences between a lot of people who have come from different countries all over the world and immigrated to the US versus people who have
right,
been here their whole time. So how do we account for the cultural differences that are
right.
naturally bound to arise?
So what you're saying is that some people have cultural advantages when it comes to higher education because they've been brought up to value it, and other groups may not. Well, you don't just value higher education for its own sake. You value higher education for its ability to build skills.
Hmm.
And ultimately they have to be measurable skills. So
Hmm.
this is where, as I said at the outset, you want some form of meritocracy to intersect with social justice. So the assumption would be, I mean, you're speaking as one individual, but let's spin that out as a group. Suppose there is a group that is brought a group of recent immigrants where children are brought up to value higher education. Well, in a demographic multiplicity, the the um, the proportion of that group in a wider demographic could somehow be identified, or at least the group could be recognized, and you would expect that when it came time for you to apply to college or graduate school, that you would meet the meritocratic standards.
Yeah. I guess that's the difficulty because I understand what you're saying because it seems like no matter what amount of social reforms that we have, there will always be a difference between what people want. And there will never be a time where equally everybody in the country will aspire for the same things. And so it seems that certain things like higher ed, for example, will admit students whose entire lives, for example, have been built around, for example, studying for the SAT, or,
Right.
doing extra. So it's like, where it becomes difficult is to figure out how you can change that without deeper social change that aligns people to what they want to be more similar. Does that make sense?
Well, you're probably not going to get everybody to value bringing up their children to aspire to higher education.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And you asked me what higher education would look like. That to answer that question doesn't tell you what the rest of society will look like. I mean, there'll always
Mm,
be some people for whom higher education is not a satisfactory option. But what we don't want is we don't want people for whom higher education is a satisfactory option to be excluded for things that have nothing to do with their skills or aspirations, right? You
mm,
want genuinely, the whole idea behind affirmative action and the slogan was widely circulated is, well, we it was recognized that there were equal opportunities, but not everybody could take advantage of those equal opportunities. So the slogan supporting affirmative action was that it would level the playing field, right?
mm,
You want to level the playing field so that uh, even though you have equal opportunities, which it looks like that's enshrined in law, not everybody is able to take advantage of those equal opportunities. For example, in New York City, there are these top specialized high schools, and they changed. They used to take the students like Bronx Science, for instance. They used to take the students with the highest middle school grades for admission, and instead, what happened in the late 19th century, late 20th century, is there was one test instituted, and only the those with the highest scores on those tests got into those preferred high schools. Now, an industry grew up in prepping students for the standardized test, and richer students whose parents had already been through the educational system could afford those preparation classes, and poorer students or students who were recent immigrants didn't understand, first of all, couldn't afford them, and didn't really understand the value of them. And the percentage of minority students, pupils in those high schools plummeted, and it still
mm,
hasn't recovered from its high in the 1970s. So, so you want systems that are not necessarily affirmative action, because you don't want them to be narrowly based on race, but you want systems that allow people to take advantage of opportunities that they might not otherwise be able to take advantage of.
mm. It's like the careful identification of people who do want to actually you know, make use of the opportunities provided rather
That's
than,
right.
is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Hmm.
So sometimes, the existence of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices on many college campuses, which are under attack. The idea behind that is you might have students who've come to college and they got in, but given their family backgrounds and the lack of certain advantages, they can't really make full use of their experience in college. They might feel handicapped, and socially they often are handicapped. So the idea is to allow those students, to give them support so they can succeed. So, for instance, many colleges have wellness programs, and included in their wellness programs, they also have safety net programs. There are large numbers of students who need housing, who are
Hmm.
homeless. There are students who are food insecure. So if you don't have a stable place to sleep, or you don't have enough food, or you have a young child and you have childcare responsibilities, even though you've been admitted to quite a good school, you may not be able to take advantage of the opportunities within that school. So there are other ways, it doesn't have to be called diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that kind of support can be reconceptualized, um, to support students after they've been admitted if they can't take advantage of the opportunities having been admitted.
Mm. So what I'm hearing you say is instead of using these buzzwords like I mean, I think that a lot of people say that about diversity. I mean, the word diversity, what does it really mean? I mean, what form of diversity are you looking for? And I think what I'm hearing you say is being more specific about what it is that you're actually trying to do rather than just throwing these buzzwords around. Is that?
Yeah, but I think we have to change the concept, because the concept of diversity is that the whole will be racially and ethnically, although the concept of ethnicity that's used is pretty narrow. It seems only to include Latino, Hispanic Americans. But the idea is the whole thing will have a mix of everybody. That's diversity, right? The whole thing
Mm,
is diverse. And I think that needs to be scrapped, and instead we need a concept of belonging. So you got to ask, well, what does it take to enable these students who might be college first generation in their family, or first in their family to attend college? What do those students need in order to feel that they belong? And
mm,
that shifts the focus, right? We're not thinking of, well, how do we make the whole thing diverse? We're not thinking of the whole thing. We're thinking, well, how do we make these individual students feel that they belong?
mm. Very cool. And so, I mean, yeah, and so in all your one of the final questions I want to ask you is in your years of working as a philosopher, and what are some of the things that you feel like you like learned
about
about
what?
I would want to use the word life, but that's too broad. But I would want to say maybe in specific, just some
About,
words of wisdom to pass down in your
oh my
years in
God.
academia.
Wisdom to pass down. Um, that's a very interesting question. You know, I thought you were going to ask me something about college culture. Um, Words of wisdom to pass down. Well, I guess I'm a Stoic, and not an avowed Stoic, but there is a branch of philosophy which began in the ancient world called Stoicism. And the way Stoicism works is, you don't worry too much about things that are outside of your control. Figure out what's in your control and pay attention to that. Work on that. Work on what's in your control. And you may be able to expand what you can control, but you can't. So there's a really interesting aspect of this in terms of other people. Most of the problems that humans experience have to do with their interactions with other people. And it's really important in terms of other people to understand that you're not going to be able to control them. You might be able to persuade
Hmm.
them. You probably won't be able to change them. But what you can control, and not perfectly, but to some degree, is yourself
Hmm.
and how you spend your time.
So how do you figure out what is and isn't in your control?
Okay, so if I can do something and get the results I want, it's in my control,
Hmm.
right? If I can't do anything and get the results I want, and I've tried various ways to address it, it's probably something that's out of my control,
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a pretty straightforward way of looking at what is and isn't in your
right?
control. Yeah.
Right?
I guess in my personal experience, I feel like I do the opposite in where I feel like everything is in my control. And so
Okay.
I feel like
So,
the humility that comes as you get older, and I think as you experience things that are no longer in your control is kind of the part that helps you differentiate between the two.
Well, and also, how are you going to deal with setbacks, right? Descartes says that this is pretty interesting too. Um, Descartes, of course, is religious. I'm not religious, but Descartes says that in the image of God, we're given the same will that God has. We have an infinite will. You can want absolutely anything, you can will absolutely anything, but your understanding is limited. So the point is that wanting something, even wanting it for the right reasons, is not going to be enough to get what you want. You have to understand how it works. It may not work in a way such that you're wanting it is sufficient for you to get it. You have to
Mm,
understand the whole thing. So I guess one has to balance one's understanding with what one wants. And it's fine to want things, but you also have to know that some of the things that you want are purely aspirational. You're not, uh, you can't control them. Look, you may want to win the lottery. Wouldn't it be nice to have $100 million, right? But it's out of your control.
yeah.
So, so if you put all your money into lottery tickets, you'll probably lose your money, and that
Mm,
might be a great disappointment. And it's not going to help you to say after the fact, well, yeah, but I wanted it so badly.
mm. So mixing
That's
your
not.
expectations and desires with what is your actions actually leading to? So kind of not having these like lofty desires.
What can you accomplish? What can you actually count on in your actions? And it's
Mm,
fine to have aspirations, but you have to know that they're aspirations,
and it's not enough. Okay, that's fair. That's a really
right?
yeah. Yeah, thanks for
A
sharing
lot
that.
of people aspire to a lot of things, and they're very disappointed. The world is not where they wanted it to be.
Mm,
Okay, well, this is where Stoicism comes in. Uh, Epictetus says you have to understand the nature of the entity that you're dealing with. So, for
mm,
instance, if he used the example of a clay pot, right? So you have a clay pot, you trip, and the pot drops and it breaks into hundreds of pieces. Well, you have to understand this is what happens to things made out of clay. They're
mm,
fragile. If you drop them, they're gonna break. Or you have another human being who's very close to you, and they die, and it looks like the ultimate tragedy. Well, you have to somehow put into the mix of your reaction that mortals die.
mm.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think that's something that I feel like I need to also just take into consideration more on a day-to-day basis, which is just understanding, what is bound to happen. I think it's history has shown already what repeatedly happens. And I mean, even your example of death, I mean, to prepare yourself knowing that that is bound to happen to those, either to you first or to the people that you love first,
Exactly.
and kind
Right.
of going into it without the false expectation of, oh, it's never going to happen to me. And that could be true for cancer, that could be true for child loss. I mean, so many things that it's I think sometimes I try to avoid the fact that these like real pains and sufferings occur in the world, and I
Well,
try to
yeah, but you don't want to live your life in kind of dread and fear
yeah.
and avoidance, but you want to be aware in a general sort of way that
So how
the
do you do
universe
both?
is,
The difficulty is doing both, right?
well, over time you can do both. I mean, sometimes you might feel quite morbid and depressed at the range of terrible things that are bound to happen. But on the other hand, there are these things under your control in your daily life that you can still accomplish.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a balancing act, right? I mean, I think in the back of one's mind is, look, you know, bad things happen. But so you prepare. You want to prepare. I've done a certain amount of work in disaster, and the big thing in disaster from car crashes to earthquakes to climate change. The big thing about disaster is preparation. People
Mm.
don't want to prepare. This bridge that got hit by the
In
by
Baltimore,
the
yeah.
ship in Baltimore. Well, the bridge was what's called fracture critical, and that meant that if you hit one part of it, the whole thing would come down. It didn't have any redundancy. So preparation would have said, don't build a bridge or don't let standing a bridge that is fracture critical. It's too big of a risk. So you can prepare. You can prepare
Mm.
for the on my campus there have been warnings of phone snatching. So especially if people have these really flashy big iPhones and somebody comes along and snatches their phone. This is now, given the world we live in, this is like an ultimate disaster, right? Somebody said, what do you do? Somebody sends you a phone. You have a phone. You can't call, but
Yeah.
everything in your mind that you refer to is on your phone. And I thought about it. And I take the bus back and forth, especially if there's a warning at bus stops, and I realized the only real way to deal with this is you just don't take your phone out.
Mm.
Unless you absolutely have to, or you're in a safe space. You can no longer. That's preparation. It's not prudent to walk along the street, absorbed in your phone, because somebody might come
Mm.
along and snatch your phone. Now you can I did ask administrators, okay, well, after they reported, well, what are you going to do about it? And they have beefed up surveillance around the campus. But the point is that, and that's a form of preparation. But then there are always things that individuals can do. Um, so you prepare for the worst and you forget about it
Mm.
until it happens, but you have some measure of preparation.
Mm.
Preparation is very important. Now, some things you can't prepare for. It's good to know that. You can't prepare for other people. I mean, the tragedy of disasters, especially these mass disasters, is the people who are responsible for our well-being, government, for example, major institutions, are very reluctant. Everybody is very reluctant to prepare in American society. It seems like a waste of money. It's not happening now. There's always something better to spend your money on, spend your time on.
Mm.
But prudence comes into this. Prudence is a
Mm.
virtue. Being prepared. Be
Wow.
prepared.
Yeah. So like identifying, so it comes from one awareness of what is likely to happen. First, being rather than being naive and purposely kind of making yourself ignorant, allowing yourself to fully see what is likely to happen and use that to then prepare for
Yeah.
those situations so that when they do occur, you kind of have these like safety nets that are already built up to prepare
Yeah.
you in the worst
Yeah.
situations.
That's right.
Yeah. So I
So it's
think it's
not
not, yeah. So rather than like losing yourself in the morbidity, what you could said at the first point, which is do what you can do where you
do
can,
it exactly.
and don't just,
Exactly.
yeah. Yeah. I
So
think that's a,
when I teach a course on disaster, I talk to my students about, okay, what if you lose power where you live and you can't go out for whatever reason? Do you have enough water for 3 days? And most
mm,
people say no. Well, you should. You should have enough water. You should have enough water for 3 days. You should have some canned food on hand. If you take medications, you should have an advanced supply of the medications. You know, um, I mean, ideally, you should have a phone charger that's always charged. The other thing is, there's in anything bad that happens, there's always a space to do something creative.
mm,
There's always something you're going to do on the moment. These are these heroes that always pop up and they do extraordinary things. So you also have to have some confidence that between your preparation or lack of preparation and whatever happens, there'll be something in the moment that you can do.
mm,
And the important thing, even if you just think about it, the important thing about thinking about these things is when something unwanted happens, you won't freeze. The worst thing is you
Mm.
just freeze. You know, a lot of people just freeze. They can't. They become totally dysfunctional, and that's the point at which you actually have to spring into action.
And so in your courses on disaster, what is your suggestion? I feel like I've never experienced, something that challenging enough to where I know whether I'm the type to freeze or not. I've never been battle tested in that sense. And so how do you
Okay.
prepare yourself so that you don't freeze?
Well, you think about it beforehand. I mean, that's just about the only thing you can do. You can think about it beforehand. If you think about it beforehand, this could happen, that could happen, that could happen, without getting into full blown morbid obsession. You think about the things that could happen. You think about the things that you could do. And um,
Hmm.
and then, the way that our minds work, the way the reality has worked for human beings, and this has been proven in various experiments. So for example, athletes, when they think about their plays before the game, when they think about the game, what's likely to happen in the game, they do better, right? So you think ahead, about what's likely to happen. And
That's
just the fact that it's no longer something that you can't even envision. I would guess most people freeze because they just never thought anything like this could happen. It's just totally new, right?
well said.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really simple is just having even 10 people's phone numbers memorized, one for every area that you're in, having your, I'm traveling right now. I'm in San Juan and I don't even have the location that I'm staying memorized. And so if I just was thinking about that right now, if I lost my phone, I wouldn't even know where to go. I wouldn't even, I'd have to figure out.
Okay,
Um,
so you don't have. I've when I've traveled in the past, I've taken this advice. Um, you can lose your phone, and your memory might fail you. But what you do is you just write down everything you need to know on an index card,
and carry
and
with you.
and have it with you all the time.
Yeah.
And you're not you it's less likely to be lost than your phone. You want to have it in a different place than where you have your phone.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for, switching gears and having I always, dang, I always have a lovely time, I think, talking about, I don't know what the right word to use is. I think life, when you use the word life, it's quite corny. And so I'm not a huge fan of saying talking quote unquote life, but I think sometimes, especially when we're talking in an academic sense, we can lose connection of us at the end of the day being human,
That's right.
like being
Existence.
alive.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Bell Hooks talks a lot about that, and I really like her
Yeah,
awareness
we're
of
talking about existence. We're talking about practical existence. And
yeah.
a lot of academics do not use their thinking skills in real world issues. It's
Hmm.
kind of beneath them, or they don't want to deal with it. And that's a mistake. I mean, you have this well developed mental apparatus. So every once in a while, shine it on something mundane that
Hmm.
will physically be important to you.
Well said. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for sharing all, this was a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm really glad we were able to get a deep dive into affirmative action, and then we were able to put the cherry on the top with this conversation.
That's great, Gotham. I enjoyed it very much, and I look forward to the publication of the podcast.
Yeah. And
And
thank you
happy
all.
travels. Happy
Yeah.
travels for you going on.
Thank you.
Get and write everything down on a small piece of paper or an
Yeah.
index card. You'll feel a lot better.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna now we had this conversation, I'm like, what am I not prepared for? I think there's a lot of things that I've been running away from because I'm too afraid to actually think about it. But I think that's gonna come and bite me in the foot later. So I think spending, a little bit a day instead of being overwhelmed with how many things that I'm not prepared for, but spending a
Right.
little, finances. Do I have, everything set up properly to where if one thing goes bad, I'm still safe in other ways, like my
Right.
housing. And I mean, there's so
Okay.
many, but I think instead of being overwhelmed, I think
Yeah.
what you were saying earlier was really good of just like look at what you can do and slowly go
Yeah.
through those. You don't have to do it all in one
And
day, but
slowly go through it. Give yourself that discipline. You're gonna okay. You spend 5 or 10 minutes a day.
hmm,
That's all it
just like
takes.
preparing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.